environmental toxins in my practice are a wide group of different exposures that we all have now, beginning at the instant that we're conceived in our mother's womb.
Mm.
And so we get exposure to toxins in the womb. And then once we are born, we get exposure to many, many more through the air we breathe, the water that we drink, food that we eat, and things that come in contact with our skin, such as cosmetics, shampoos, and even what we use to launder our clothes with. So it's a wide variety of things, including biological substances. It can actually be viruses and germs and the toxins that they give off, molds, parasites, but it can also be a wide group of man-made chemicals that's rapidly growing. At last estimate, about 90,000 man-made chemicals. The majority are toxic to man, and the majority have never really been very well studied to see exactly what effects they do have, and then very poorly controlled as far as our exposure. There's a finite group of what we call toxic elements, things such as mercury, lead, cadmium, aluminum, arsenic, that we have all been exposed to forever, but early man was almost never significantly exposed because of the nature of the early environment. Now they're present in many things that we eat and drink, put on our skin, and even in the air that we breathe. Also, electromagnetic radiation of certain kinds even can be natural, such as, for example, solar flares and sunspots, but more often it's some of the new man made sorts of physical toxins, such as 5G, Wi Fi, Bluetooth, what we call EMFs and EMRs. Um, so these are the main groups of environmental toxins, but I also like to make sure that I stress to people that in my world, what I call toxic life experiences are just as bad at causing persistent illness as these actual toxins. Some people might just call those stressful life events or just stress. But I can't tell you how many times patients tell me that it was a stressful life experience that acted as the last straw that broke the camel's back to lead them into a wide litany of symptoms and dysfunction that relates to their chronic illness. So, as a result of these toxins and toxic life experiences, it leads us into a discussion with our patients that involves avoidance, elimination, or detox. Oftentimes, we talk about their own personal sensitivity to these toxins and stresses and how we can change that for the better. But almost always, we have a discussion with our patient that involves what I call the threat response center. And there's a part of our brain that all humans have, and even ancient humans all had. And we know that even primitive animals such as snakes and frogs and rabbits and mammals have, that is basically a part of the brain, a finite part. Some people actually call it the limbic system or the autonomic nervous system. But that part of the brain is there to receive all of the information that comes to it, both through the nerves that feed the brain from the rest of the body, nerves from the intestine, such as the vagus nerve, and all of the rest of the nervous impulses, and also circulating signals that might come to that part of the brain through the bloodstream. Some of those might be toxins and other even poisonous substances or signaling substances. Some of them produced by the cells themselves, and some of them possibly even produced by some of the things in our body. But anyway, the brain receives all this information and it basically comes up with a perception or a sense of whether the individual is safe or in danger. And it turns out that that danger response or threat response actually gives rise to many of the signs and symptoms that we know as chronic illness. And there's a few mechanisms that it's valuable to know about. I would say for me, a mechanism that has really completely changed my practice was when I began to understand about one mechanism that we call the mitochondrial cell danger response. And this is not a new thing. It's really an evolved situation or aspect of our bodies that even our ancient ancestors all had. But what it means, and science has shown, that when the brain is receiving signals of danger and threat, one of the things that happens is the brain actually controls the cellular energy production of our mitochondria, and it's able to send signals that causes those mitochondria to go into a state of partial downregulation. And it actually evolved because for early humans and probably early animals and even animals today, it provided some evolutionary benefit or advantage that I could go into, but it's a little complicated. Suffice it to say that when our brain perceives danger, our mitochondria go into a state of downregulation and we don't have as much ATP energy as we otherwise would have. And often that's extremely limiting. So in my practice, that goes a long way to explaining the severe fatigue that my patients often have, and also their intolerance of exertion. That's why so many of them basically can't do anything physical. Now, the cool thing about the cell danger response is that it can be very quick to come on and it can be very quick to go off. So it's very reversible. It's not a permanent condition at all. And so certainly that's one of the things that the brain does to the body when it's in a place of threat. And the other thing that happens when the brain is in a place of danger is it tends to cause an evolutionary upregulation of all of our different senses: sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of hearing and sight. And also our immune system goes into a setting of upregulation or hypersensitivity. And again, I believe it was evolved for protective purposes. But in today's world, when our senses are in a place of hypersensitivity and our immune system, it actually begins to be more of an impediment. It's actually part of the problem. And so when our immune systems are overactive, it can actually lead to what we call immune self-injury. And that can be also said as allergy, autoimmunity, inflammation, histamine response, mast cell activation, many terms to describe it. But and in terms of the hypersensitivity, sometimes that's what we know as PTSD. People say, for example, from in a military setting, when they've been put in danger for their lives, many times these people become what they used to use the term shell shocked, and basically they couldn't function as a result of their bodies being in such a reactive state. So what we've learned is that we want to try to help that brain not be in that place of danger, but instead to perceive that we're safe, calm tranquility. Now that's also a part of the autonomic nervous system that we know as the parasympathetic, whereas the threat response is more associated with the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system. And it's oftentimes that there's an imbalance in this duality. But clearly one of the things that we work on with our patients is understanding how can they increase that parasympathetic calm tranquility and help that balance. And it takes both knowing what to do that, the things that we can learn to do if we practice them, and then we have to practice them on a regular basis. It's not enough to know just what to do, but never practice it. And it's not enough to practice something that's really not effective. So it's a matter of learning that. And then also we have to, of course, remove the toxins and the stressful life experiences that are causing the signals to come to the brain that say you're not safe. And that's also something that we have to work with. But it's amazing the benefit that we can see just from helping a person understand that they are in at least some control over that if they learn to take advantage of that control. Yeah, I think in general in today's world, again, since our sources are the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, and things that come in contact with our bodies, our skin, our hair, and also things that might be implanted in our bodies. For example, tattoo ink, for example, or various implants, even root canals. I think it's important for us to do what we can to live as pure and clean as we can. The air that we breathe, which unfortunately we always don't have total control over that, the water that we drink, or in some cases, it's not just water. Sometimes it's other beverages that we might choose to drink. The food that we eat, and then the kind of products that we allow to be in contact with our bodies, whether it's cosmetics that we use or laundry detergents or the way we clean and treat our homes. Um, these are some of the basics that I talk to my patients about. And I love to talk to the kids about it because, the kids just get it that we're living in a progressively toxic, polluted world. And as a result, my business flourishes. But I'd kind of prefer that it not be flourishing and that more of us could live in a clean environment where we didn't have to constantly be thinking about these threats. Yeah, I think that there may actually be a place for technology to, over time, provide us some answers, um, especially technology that ends up increasing our body of awareness and knowledge. But unfortunately, with technological progress in the world, we're basically, at least currently, seeing the development of many more toxins. I mean, just for example, the man-made chemicals that continue to be invented on an annual basis. I mean, I think when I went to medical school a few years ago, we might have been talking about 50,000 or 60,000 man-made chemicals in the environment. Today, we're talking about 85 to 90,000. And in 10 or 15 years, that number is only going to be much, much higher. I mean, just looking at the electromagnetic radiation, we first started seeing people that had illness associated with electromagnetic about the time that we electrified our society. Shortly after the light bulb was invented and the telephone was invented, and we started stringing telegraph and telephone and electric wires throughout the world. That's when we first started to see problems. Some of the earliest people that were sick from electromagnetic radiation exposure were the telephone operators. Remember the ladies that sat there and moved the lines around? They actually organized in their unions for protection against those kinds of symptoms of illness, which are basically the ones that we see today: fatigue, brain fog, etc. Also, around the time of the development of radar, a lot of people, especially some of the radar operators in the Army and Navy, began to have lots of symptoms of illness associated with radar exposure. And then, of course, a lot of the linemen that were working around power lines and that sort of thing. So, in my mind, our technological progress up until now has really just resulted in progressive worsening of the problem. And one thing about biological toxins is, think about this. Uh, 50,000 years ago, most humans lived in a small group and they spent their lives often within a few miles of where they were born, lived and died. And they had a fairly small number of other individuals that they would interact with during their lifetime. Think of today with worldwide travel, and people are moving from point A to point B, country A to country B. And with that, all of the various little microbes that coexist with us have begun to become global, you know. And so I think even within the realm of biological illness, pathogens, we're in a different world now because of our global society. So I'm afraid to say that unless people begin to wake up to the fact that changing this takes a real effort, you know, to me, understanding the toxic effect of these man-made chemicals, knowing when we should be using them and why we should be using them and how much we should be using, the smart use of electromagnetic radiation, um, all of these things I think really warrant us paying a lot more attention to. Certainly, the movement to recycle and reuse has been very beneficial in trying to reduce the amount of plastics in the environment, for example. But when they talk about plastic the size of Connecticut in our North Pacific Ocean, that's nothing but plastic bottles and straws and bottle caps, to me, it's a little bit concerning. You know, are we going to really get ahead of this? And that's why doctors like me that are trained like I am and pay attention to the things that I pay attention to are really on the rise in the healthcare field. And it's for good reason, because with these kinds of problems, we typically don't need a new pharmaceutical drug. What we need is somebody that's going to help us understand our exposures and how do we eliminate them, help us understand what we need to make our bodies be more resistant, and then helping our brains learn to not be in such a state of fear and threat and danger as a result of these exposures. So I
So in
try to be optimistic, but sometimes it can be a little bit difficult. Yeah, I think more than anything about the brain, that is the way that the part of the brain that we call I call it the threat brain. Some people call it the autonomic nervous system or the limbic system, but it's the part of the brain that we've evolved to take in all the information that comes from the body and then come up with a perception of safety versus danger. And it's that danger response that typically causes the biggest part of the problem. Now, a lot of my patients do have a lot of symptoms that relate to abnormalities within the cranial vault, the brain, you could say. And these include not only all of the cognitive issues that my patients suffer from, such as problems word finding, memory problems, problem solving problems, reading problems, writing problems, but also all of the mood related aspects of the brain, whether or not they're anxious or sad or having intrusive thoughts or even ideations, certain even ideations for suicidality and self harm. All of these things basically can be affected by these various toxins and toxic experiences affecting the brain itself. But clearly, in my world, the threat brain is probably of primary importance. And the cool thing about that is that we can actually do something about it. If we can help people understand that they do have some control that they can exercise over their brain and whether or not it perceives that they're safe or in danger, it can be very valuable to them. The the approach in my practice to environmental illness begins with a real thorough history. We sit down with that patient and we basically explore all of the things that have gone on before. And especially we focus in on when the symptoms of illness really began, or in some cases when they just dramatically increased. And based on that history, a lot of times we can get a real understanding of what are the underlying root causes. We also like to explore the factors from the history that might impact on their own personal sensitivity, whether it be family history and genetic issues or just other prior exposures that might have caused their bodies to be more in a place of sensitivity. Because that's another important thing that we have to deal with if we're going to help people recover is how can we change their personal sensitivity for the better. Um, I would say these are my main approaches. Sometimes after the history, it involves a physical examination to see if there's any physical signs that lead us in a direction. But many times we have to make individualized decisions about various assessments, whether it be blood testing or urine testing or stool testing or breath testing. There's just many other ways that we can evaluate to see some of these underlying causes. In some cases, we even talk about genetics testing, which helps us understand about the person's genetic makeup and how that might impact into their sensitivity to toxins and stress.